It may be difficult for us to imagine that in the late 1770s, the border of the American western frontier ran through the Wyoming Valley. This beautiful valley, 20 miles long and 3 miles wide, with the Susquehanna River running through it, was isolated from the cities and coastal areas of colonial America, where the Revolutionary War was being fought between the colonies and Great Britain. This could cause anyone to think that settlers lived together in peace and harmony in a quiet region. But just the opposite was true. The Wyoming Valley, whose name is derived from the Indian term meaning large plains, was the hostile target of many groups. Fear, death, and destruction filled the air. For 2 centuries, the valley was claimed by the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, an association of Native American tribes centered in present-day New York State. They defeated the Delaware tribes and put them in charge of the Wyoming Valley as a buffer against any settlers moving in and taking control. But there were other Native American tribes also living here, such as the Mohegan, Shawnee, and Nanticoke. Beginning in the 1740s, outsiders drifted into the valley. Some were fur traders, and some were missionaries. They came from New England in the north and William Penn's colony in the south. As would be expected, their presence was greeted with contempt by the native tribes. When these visitors returned home, the stories they told of the beauty and fertility of the valley influenced others to make the journey. In 1662, King Charles II granted a royal charter to Connecticut to possess a region which is now the state of Pennsylvania. Later in 1681, he also granted a royal charter to William Penn settlers for the very same land. Settlers from both groups came to live in the Wyoming Valley, assuming ownership. The resulting conflict between the two came to be called the Yankee-Pennamite Wars. The Yankees from Connecticut and the Pennamites from William Penn settlers. Many Connecticut citizens bought shares in the Susquehanna Land Company, giving them the right to migrate to the Wyoming Valley and to own a parcel of land. In 1762, a group of approximately 100 shareholders came and settled on the east bank of the Susquehanna River along Mill Creek. This area is near the location of General Hospital today in North Wilkes-Barre area. The New England people boldly cleared a large tract of land on which they built log houses, a gristmill, a sawmill, and prepared a section of land for farming. As autumn came and winter followed, these Connecticut Yankees, unprepared to survive the cold weather, returned home. The Delaware Indians, who had kept them under a watchful eye, warned them not to return. But as spring arrived, the Yankees did return, bringing additional settlers, farm animals, and a large store of supplies. The return of the settlers sparked a bloody struggle with the natives. Blaming the settlers for the death of their tribal chief, the Delawares attacked the settlement in 1763 in an effort to destroy it. Through the summer and fall, many settlers were killed. Cabins were burned, livestock was scattered, and crops were destroyed. Finally, on October 15, 1763, the entire settlement was destroyed. Those who escaped the attacks of the Native Americans somehow made their way back to Connecticut. The valley was empty of settlers for 6 years. In 1769, the Connecticut settlers, with great tenacity, returned to the area and faced a very serious confrontation with colonists from Pennsylvania, who were determined to stay also as claimed legal ownership of the Wyoming Valley. They brought with them a contingent of civil and military persons to defend the fur trading post operated by the William Penn family. Another group of 40 Yankees from Connecticut arrived and settled on the west bank of the river. They erected a large rectangular wooden fort and armed themselves for protection. In honor of their number, they named the settlement the Fort of 40, and later Forty Fort. The modern borough of Forty Fort stands on that site today. At the very same time, the William Penn colonists were entering the valley from the south. They built a fort in the southern portion of the riverfront and made plans to drive the settlers back to Connecticut. The struggle became America's first civil war, but settled nothing. General George Washington, in the midst of the war between Britain and the colonists, called all able-bodied men to the Continental Army. The British authorities were well aware that the Wyoming Valley supplied the Continental Army with men, food, and supplies. Since their scouts reported that the valley was practically defenseless, the British decided to forcibly end the valley's support of the American Revolution. In the spring of 1778, an army composed of British, Tories, and Indians were gathered at Fort Niagara under the command of Major John Butler. Marching southwest, they came to the present-day city of Athens on the north branch of the Susquehanna River. Using rafts and flat-bottom boats, they landed south of Tunkhannock. Here they were joined by a group of Seneca Indians, giving them a total group of approximately 1,100 men. They began an 18-mile overland march through a cut in the mountains and finally to the northern part of the Wyoming Valley, where on July 1st, 1778, approximately 12 farmers were working in their fields at what is now called Harding. It was reported that 7 of the men were captured and tortured to death. 5 of them escaped, hid until nightfall, and wandered into Fort Jenkins, where West Pittston stands today. This episode is often referred to as the Harding Massacre. The next day, Fort Wintermoot, located along the Susquehanna River a mile south of Fort Jenkins, surrendered to the invading army without a fight. It is said that many Tories were inside the fort and simply opened the gates. Soon after, Fort Jenkins capitulated, since with so few patriots they could not offer any resistance. 4 miles south of Fort Wintermoot was 40 Fort, being the largest and strongest fort in the entire Wyoming Valley. Many of the residents in the area fled there for safety. A serious confrontation took place at the fort on the morning of July 3, 1778. A delegation delivered a demand from British Major Butler. He ordered the unconditional surrender of the fort, its garrison, and its supplies. If they refused to surrender, Major Butler would attack the fort with full strength. The demand was completely rejected by Colonel Nathan Dennison, an officer who was commissioned by the Connecticut Assembly to be in charge of the fort. An alarm was immediately sounded throughout the valley, carried by couriers to all local areas. The message was urgent. All able-bodied patriots are summoned to bring their rifles and supplies and to report at once to the 40 Fort. Colonel Zebulon Butler, a cousin of British Major Butler, both from Connecticut but on opposite sides of the conflict, heard the call. He was at Fort Wilkes-Barre. Zebulon Butler and his force crossed the Susquehanna and made a swift 6-mile march to 40 Fort. Along with many volunteers, approximately 375 men had gathered. They would be under the leadership of both Colonel Butler and Colonel Dennison. In order to keep the enemy as far away as possible from their homes and farms, the Patriots at 40 Fort chose to leave the security of the fort and march north to intercept the enemy. The band of fighters marched bravely out of 40 Fort near the hour of 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They chose to travel over the Great Road, today's Wyoming Avenue. At Abrams Creek, the group took a short rest to reconsider their plan to confront the enemy. The final decision was to stay the course and move further ahead. At 4 p.m., they halted and set up a battle line at what is now 4th Street in the borough of Wyoming. A mile away, Major Butler and his British forces set up their battle line in what is now Valley Street in the borough of Exeter. When the British Tory contingent heard that the Patriots were approaching, they feigned a retreat. In order to convince the Patriots that they were leaving, they burned Fort Wintermoot. Colonel Zebulon Butler completely took the bait and gave the order to advance. The British Tory group sprang up behind rocks and fences and struck the Patriots from the front and side. Simultaneously, the Seneca warriors leaped from their concealment by a nearby swamp, outflanked the unsuspecting Patriots, and struck them from the rear. Colonel Dennison saw the development and called for his men to reposition themselves to meet the new threat. Unfortunately, his troops misinterpreted this communication and thought he was calling for a retreat. The line was broken, and men fled in chaos. The Battle of Wyoming, one of the bloodiest of the war, lasted approximately 45 minutes and left Patriots dead. The victorious British and Tories made it clear the Wyoming Valley was still under their control and would be loyal to the king. The Revolutionary War had officially come to the Wyoming Valley. The British insisted on a formal ceremony of surrender by the Patriots. Colonel Nathan Dennison was forced to sign the Articles of Capitulation in the presence of British Major John Butler the very next day in the burned-out ruins of Fort Wintermoot. How humiliating this public act of surrender must have been for Colonel Dennison. The Articles of Capitulation stipulated that the colonies could keep their farms provided they did not bear arms. The British received control of the forts, guns, and related supplies. With the situation assumedly stabilized, the British and Tories withdrew to Fort Niagara. As the Patriots began to disperse, they were set upon by the revenge-seeking Seneca Indians. Many Patriots were killed. Some tried to escape by swimming to a nearby island, but were pursued and put to death. There is a traditional tale that Queen Esther of the Senecas had some Patriots brought to her, and blaming them for the death of her son, crushed their heads against a huge rock. That rock is still there, located on the Wyoming side of the 8th Street Bridge.
On July 29, 1778, the Connecticut Journal published a survivor's account of the Battle of Wyoming. Quote, "The helpless fugitives from the place escaped with little more than their lives. They could bring nothing with them, hardly clothes to cover them, and nothing to eat. Many were 2 or 3 days without sustenance, and several pregnant women were delivered alone in the woods."
Many who escaped this massacre were fearful of returning to the valley. The region lay unoccupied for several years. A small group did come back about 10 weeks later to bury the victims of the mass attack. When reports of the catastrophe reached General Washington, he was furious. He sent an army under the command of General James Sullivan and General James Clinton to find the Indian villages of western New York and destroy them. According to historian Joseph R. Fisher, the army had brought a whirlwind of destruction. Their torches had reduced 40 Iroquois towns and villages to ashes and destroyed 160,000 bushels of corn. Sullivan reported to Washington and Congress that there was not a single village left in the country of the 5 nations. The burning of Iroquois homes, crops, and food stores ensured the deaths of thousands by freezing and starvation during what would be called the coldest winter on record at the time. The Indians would never attack the Wyoming Valley again, but it did not remain peaceful. Many Connecticut settlers returned to the area, and the fight for the land continued. Congress passed a bill that granted the land to the Penn Group, but allowed the settlers who supported the British to continue to live on and farm the land. Despite this decision, conflicts continued for a few more years when Connecticut finally relinquished its claims to the Wyoming Valley. In order that the sacrifices of the Valley Patriots would never be forgotten, a stately monument to their memory was first proposed in 1809. A local paper reported that a committee of 66 men were set to meet at the courthouse in Wilkes-Barre in January of 1810. Apparently nothing came of this. The next mention of a monument appeared in the Susquehanna Democrat on September 15, 1826.
Wyoming Monument. Measures have been taken by the enterprising and patriotic citizens of the Valley of Old Wyoming for erecting a monument to the memory of those who fell in the memorable Wyoming Massacre by the Indians and a more merciless race of beings called Tories. What can redound more to the glory and honor of the present inhabitants of that pleasant and fertile vale than such a monument with a suitable inscription to point the wayward traveler to the spot where their fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters met so dreadful and untimely a fate.
Stone was quarried from a site on the east side of the Susquehanna, and in 1833, a cornerstone was finally laid.
The Wyoming Republican, Kingston, Wednesday, July 10th, 1833. Ceremony of laying the cornerstone of a monument to the memory of those who fell in the massacre on the 3rd day of July, 1778, was performed on Wednesday last, the anniversary of the day on which that melancholy event occurred. The scene was interesting and solemn. It was unlike the ordinary laying of a cornerstone of a monument, where meditation upon some patriotic event alone inspired feeling. The bones of those who were massacred in an attempt to defend their country and their families, and to whose memory a monument is to be erected, had been dug from the earth and were exhibited to the assembled multitude. To look upon a great number of skulls and other human bones, some bearing the marks of the tomahawk and scalping knife, and others perforated with balls, awakened a sense of the suffering of those Wyoming heroes, and led the mind to reflect upon the cause in which they had lost their lives. Casting the eye over the fertile valley, viewing the luxuriant fields, the many fine habitations, and other indications of prosperity, happiness, and plenty, and then looking upon the huge mass of the bones of those who fell in attempting to defend it, it was too much to meditate upon without feeling the most solemn emotions. Nor did this alone make the scene solemnly interesting. There were present several aged veterans who were in the battle, and several who 55 years before had assisted in gathering and burying the bodies, the remains of which were now before them. There were present several whose fathers were slain, and whose bones were in the mass, and a number of others who had lost brothers or other connections, and whose remains they were permitted to look upon after they had been laid beneath the sod more than a half a century. There were present many who, in looking upon a bone, knew not but the eye was resting upon the naked fragment of a parent, a brother, or some other connection. Truly, the scene was solemn and interesting beyond description. The ceremony of laying the cornerstone was performed by Mr. Elijah Blackman, an aged veteran who was in the battle. A box was deposited in the stone containing a history of the early settlement of the valley, an account of the battle, a list of as many of the names of those who fell in the battle as could be obtained, a copy of the official account of the battle transmitted at the time by Colonel Zebulon Butler to the Secretary of War, a copy of the address delivered by Chester Butler, Esquire, the muster roll of a company commanded by Captain Samuel Ransom, made out in September 1777, a copy of the address delivered by the Reverend Mr. May at the celebration of the event, June 3, 1832, and a copy of the remarks then made by the Reverend Mr. Murray. One piece of each denomination of United States coin, each of the papers published in Luzerne County. The ceremony of depositing the box was performed by Mr. Samuel Carey, another aged veteran who was in the battle. He was assisted by Judge Scott. Mr. Carey then spoke a short time, during which he evinced much feeling and a great degree of satisfaction with the proceedings of the day. The bones were then placed in the grave and the foundation prepared for the monument. During the time occupied in depositing these, the battalion fired 3 rounds. After prayer by the Reverend John Dorrance, the assemblage dispersed in good order. Never, we presume, was there so large a multitude collected together in this county. The number of those present was estimated at from 2,000 to 3,000.
In a year, construction reached a height of 20 feet when it stopped temporarily due to a lack of funds. In 1841, the project was revived with a fund drive by the newly formed Ladies Monument Association. The original design was altered by rebuilding the base and superstructure with white marble, and wanting the very best structure as a fitting tribute to the Patriots, the association turned to a Philadelphia monument designer, Thomas U. Walter, who later won fame as the chief designer of the great cast iron dome of the United States Capitol. The result, completed in 1848, was a magnificent structure, somewhat like a great obelisk. It is an impressive, inspirational experience to all who come to view the structure. The monument does not stand on the actual ground where the battle and massacre took place. That is about 4 miles away in present-day Exeter, but it's located on the very spot where the skeletons of the victims of the encounter are interred. These remains are housed within the base of the monument. The names of the fallen are inscribed on the monument's surface. The very presence of this eloquent structure is a reminder of the price our heroes paid to prevent the British forces from stealing their liberty. A member of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission has called the edifice, quote, a monument to our patriots and a landmark to our nation. It is a physical reminder of the dangerous years in the Wyoming Valley.